Today I'm going to do a brief historical overview of the American horror film in order to provide some context within which to view individual films going forward. We're going to be looking only at sound films, but I did want to point out that horror film has some very strong roots in silent film as well. For example, in the United States, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein had been adapted to horror film as early as 1910. And of course, the visual style of horror was developed very extensively in German Expressionist cinema in the early 1920s in such horror films as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu in 1920 and 1922, respectively. As the sound era came in, horror film quickly became even more important. In particular, studios such as Universal and Paramount got into horror film in a very big way. Universal is the one that's most associated with this phenomenon, of course, and had great early success with their adaptations of Dracula and Frankenstein, both in 1931. This success, among other things, encouraged Paramount to try to get into the horror film business, and they basically tried to outdo Universal by making their films more violent and more erotic, including the original Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1931 and The Island of Lost Souls from 1932. Incidentally, I might point out that Charles Laughton's performance in The Island of Lost Souls is perhaps the first truly great acting performance in an American horror film. If you get a chance, you might want to try to take a look at that sometime if you've never seen it. I might also point out that American studios were a little bit concerned that they might scare their audiences a little bit too much with horror film because it was a new thing. But still, they were able to get away with quite a bit, largely because there were no real rules in place for what films could do, which was causing the movie business in general to get kind of a bad reputation. Uh, in response to which, the Hollywood studios developed a production code in 1930 that laid out some rules for what could and couldn't be done in film, though this code was not actually implemented until 1934, so it didn't affect the early films from before 1934. Once it did come out, though, it had a major effect on American horror film, and in general, horror films started to go downhill fairly quickly after the full implementation of the production code. Universal, in particular, was curbed in their efforts to establish Frankenstein and Dracula franchises going forward. Though I should also point out that Bride of Frankenstein, one of the first horror films made under the full implementation of the code, might be the greatest horror film of the 1930s. In fact, one of the reasons it's great is because if you know the background, it becomes really kind of funny because of the way in which director James Whale was playing with the censors and just seeing how much he could get away with that was actually in violation of the code. Another thing that happened was that MGM, which had the reputation of being sort of the smoothest and most sophisticated and stylish of the major film studios in America, at this time started to try to develop horror films that really didn't seem like horror films. They didn't have very much violence. There was nothing graphic in them. They were just kind of a little bit maybe tense here and there. Films like Todd Browning's The Devil Doll and Carl Freund's Mad Love with Peter Lorre, who became a kind of minor horror film star, were among the MGM efforts in the 1930s. By the 1940s, the Universal franchises had degenerated mostly into farces and problematic mashups. The Wolfman from 1941 with Lon Chaney Jr. Was an exception to this trend. It was one of the few really good horror films that Universal put out after 1940 for quite some time, largely because of the way that Chaney's performance made the monster unusually sympathetic. But what was really dominant in Universal films of the 40s were mashups in which they combined one or more of their other monsters, such as the 1943 film Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And most of those didn't turn out too well, though some of them were better than others. In particular, many people regard the mashup Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein as a comic classic. Probably the best horror films of the 1940s were the ones produced by Val Lewton for RKO Pictures. These included films that you can see listed here. There's several more, actually, beginning with Cat People in 1942 and I Walked with a Zombie in 1943. And actually, the last film that Lewton produced for RKO was a film called Bedlam, which starred Boris Karloff, of course, of Frankenstein fame. These films are famous primarily for their aesthetics and their ability through visuals in particular to create a very kind of eerie and creepy atmosphere. Using expressionist techniques of lighting and photography that were clearly influenced by the German films of the 1920s, but that also clearly influenced a lot of American films that came forward, including other horror films, but also including film noir. These films were made in the very early years of film noir when the noir aesthetic was just being developed, and Lewton's films definitely contributed to the development of that aesthetic. And some of the people who worked with him, like Jacques Tourneur, who was the director of Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, became one of the most important directors of film noir later. After World War II and into the 1950s, horror began to make something of a comeback. House of Wax, for example, in 1953, made Vincent Price a horror star, and for many years afterward, he was perhaps the biggest star in American horror. Probably, though, in terms of pure horror films, the most important horror films of the 50s were made in Britain by Hammer Films, which largely just reintroduced the Universal monsters, especially Frankenstein and Dracula, making a whole series of films over a period of about 15 years featuring both of those characters. Most American horror films of the 50s were as much science fiction as horror films. They usually had some kind of monsters that were created by radiation or some other science fictional kind of motif, and obviously were responding to the nuclear fears of the Cold War. American horror itself began to aim for teen audiences by the late 1950s, and for some people this led to a kind of juvenilization of the films, though that trend certainly turned around in 1960 with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which took the horror film in a very much darker direction and really became ultimately the first slasher film. Another name worthy of mention in this period is Roger Corman, who became a sort of master of low-budget horror. His film Bucket of Blood from 1959 is one of the craziest things you've ever seen. I really do recommend it if you've never seen it. It's basically a parody of House of Wax, but it's so over the top that it's really, you have to see it to believe it. Corman's biggest success in horror film probably was with a series of 8 adaptations of the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, though adaptations is a term I use loosely here because some of them had very little to do with the Poe work that they were inspired by. House of Usher was the first of these in 1960, and probably the best of them, and certainly the most successful with audiences at the time, was The Mask of the Red Death, and these films featured, again, Vincent Price. As the 1960s went forward, a lot of things were changing in the 1960s, and one of them was the production code, which began to unravel as the decade went forward, which enabled the growth of much bloodier and scarier horror films, including a lot of really rough and gritty low-budget horror films. Some of these have come to be known as gross-out horror and subsequently. Probably the king of gross-out horror during this period was a director by the name of Herschel Gordon Lewis, who became known as the Godfather of Gore. His masterpiece was probably the notorious film 2000 Maniacs from 1964. And basically, you have these sort of Confederate flag-waving, banjo-picking, shit-kicking, redneck Southerners in this one particular small Southern town who capture any Northerners who happen to wander into their town and then horribly murder them, cook them up, and eat them. This, of course, made 2000 Maniacs sort of the founding work in a genre that some people have come to call hillbilly horror. Basically, hillbilly horror is exactly what it sounds like. Somebody from the North, or at least some outsider, wanders into some hillbilly enclave, and with very, very dire results. Some hillbilly horror films, of course, are better than others, and some of them have been major Hollywood productions. The hillbilly horror films after 2000 Maniacs that have been imported have been things like Deliverance in 1972, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, The Hills Have Eyes from 1977, Jeepers Creepers 2001, Wrong Turn 2003, and Tucker and Dale vs. Evil 2010, though Tucker and Dale vs. Evil is actually a comedy. It's a kind of send-up of hillbilly horror films and a number of other kinds of horror films as well, though hillbilly horror is the most important. Then in 1968, things began to change a bit with the production of Rosemary's Baby, which went a long way toward making horror film a bit more respectable. This was a major Hollywood production with an A-list director in Roman Polanski, a first-rate cast, and also first-rate production values. This initiated a trend of suggesting that the most horrifying events in life really reside in ordinary everyday life, maybe in the home, maybe within the family. You don't have to be in a haunted house. You don't have to be attacked by vampires. And so I think that sort of horror that some people come to call domestic horror was relatively new at that time, but has become very, very prominent ever since. A number of prominent horror films followed Rosemary's Baby, of course, because it was so successful, culminating in the success of The Exorcist in 1973, which at that time was the most commercially successful at the box office horror film ever made, and also the most probably awarded in terms of Academy Award nominations and things like that. On the other hand, 1968 was also the year of Night of the Living Dead, which continued the trend of ultra-low-budget films in the horror genre of the 1960s. But it was ultimately just as influential as Rosemary's Baby, becoming, of course, the first of a long string of modern zombie films. As the 1970s moved forward, we saw something of a golden age in American film in general. A lot of different genres, science fiction by the end of the decade, neo-noir, a lot of new things were happening. And of course, major films like The Godfather that became acclaimed masterpieces of American cinema all came out in the 1970s. And horror film was part of this trend as well. Some of this includes again, relatively big budget, commercially successful films like The Exorcist. Another one of these would be Brian De Palma's original film of Carrie, 1976, which you might remember was recently remade. And at the same time, you also had films that went in the other direction of more shocking content, maybe a little bit rougher production values, with things like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978 would become a crucial beginning point for horror franchises. There had been other slasher films before Halloween, again, especially Psycho, and things like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, in addition to being hillbilly horror, is also a slasher film of sorts. But Halloween really kind of established it as a phenomenon, and after Halloween, slasher films became the most important phenomenon in American horror for the next decade. And again, we're dominated by franchises like the Halloween franchise, the Friday the 13th franchise, and the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And then, of course, the decade ended with Alien in 1979, in which the newly emergent trends in horror film and science fiction film kind of converged together into Alien. Alien's regarded as a classic of science fiction film, but it's also really a kind of slasher film. The alien creature in Alien basically is a particularly formidable slasher. Horror film is, of course, a genre that responds well to social anxieties, and a lot of people have noted that the horror boom of the 1970s responded to a period of great social anxieties in America with things like Vietnam and Watergate, for example. And things like the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution. I mean, there are lots of things going on that kind of reminded Americans that life wasn't always as nice and peaceful as they were hoping it would be. And the Watergate scandal also reminded us that you can't necessarily trust the government or authorities. Meanwhile, the rise of the environmentalist movement in the 1970s made Americans aware of the potential for global environmental catastrophe at a time when, of course, there were still a lot of fears associated with the Cold War as well. In addition to the higher profile horror films of the 1970s, any discussion of the boom of the 1970s should at least throw in a mention of Larry Cohen, who was a kind of low budget horror film auteur during that decade. His films were very, very profitable, partly because they didn't cost much to make, but also partly because they really appealed to audiences because they captured so many of the anxieties of the decade, especially in his central It's Alive series, beginning with the film called It's Alive in 1974, and then going through two sequels released respectively in 1978 and 1987. Again, should also point out, though, that the boom in horror film in the 1970s was a part of a boom in horror film, in Hollywood film in general, through the phenomenon that's come to be known as the New Hollywood, where you had the collapse of the production code came about at the same time as the studio system itself of the classical era was collapsing. And so Hollywood was being restructured, reorganized. It was possible to make new kinds of film. And just as this happened, we had a whole new generation of really talented young directors. Among other things, the first generation of directors to have attended film school. So they were also very knowledgeable and knew about what their predecessors had done. And so directors like Peter Bogdanovich, Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, Roman Polanski, Stanley Kubrick, George Lucas, and Steven Spielberg all came onto the scene right about at the same time in the early 1970s and helped to transform Hollywood. And those names, of course, will be mentioned several times, many of those names in this lecture, because almost all of them, with the exception of Lucas, worked in horror film, at least to some extent at one time or another. And you could even say that Lucas's Star Wars franchise definitely overlaps with horror in a lot of ways. Characters like Darth Vader, for example, are almost like horror film characters. Horror, in fact, played a very key role in the New Hollywood movement. And you could argue that basically the New Hollywood period begins roughly with Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 and runs to Heaven's Gate in 1980. That's, in fact, the conventional story. But you could also say that it begins roughly with Rosemary's Baby in 1968 and runs through The Shining in 1980. Depending on how you want to formulate your history of Hollywood, the New Hollywood period really does correspond very closely to that boom period in horror film. Again, most of the really prominent New Hollywood directors did work in horror at one time or another. On the other hand, as we moved into the 1980s, as I indicated earlier, this trend toward more sophisticated horror films in the 70s was sort of sidetracked by the slasher craze of the 1980s. Slasher films could be fairly sophisticated and could be really interesting films, but often they just degenerated into bloodfests. Still, the 1980s certainly were the great age of slasher horror franchises. Halloween beginning in 1978, Friday the 13th beginning in 1980, and Nightmare on Elm Street beginning in 1984 inspired long streams of sequels. Slasher horror also spilled over into other genres in the 1980s, such as the original Terminator film from 1984 and Blood Simple, the first Coen Brothers film from 1984. The Terminator's nominally science fiction, Blood Simple is nominally neo-noir, but they both draw extensively upon the slasher film for their visuals and various other motifs. In addition, the horror market of the 1980s was fairly large, largely thanks to the success of horror film in the 1970s. So there was room for other things, even though the slasher film was so dominant. The Shining, for example, started out the decade and reminded us that there was still a place for high art horror films like Rosemary's Baby had been. The Evil Dead franchise became a sort of hipper alternative to slasher films to mainstream audiences. Also very bloody, but also very funny and just completely over the top with Bruce Campbell's performance. And then even more offbeat films such as Reanimator also found an audience. So horror film, I think, was reaching a sort of maturity in the 1980s when it could extend in new directions, including directions that were largely spoofs of horror films that would only work if their audiences were fairly familiar with horror films. And so by the 1980s, directors could, in fact, assume that their audiences did know horror film. The 1990s are typically seen as a little bit of a sideways decade for American horror film, where if through most of the decade there wasn't that much progress. Though one of the things that did happen is that horror film kind of, as the slasher film began to lose dominance, the horror film in general began to seek new directions and new kinds of films. And things like Silence of the Lambs and Seven in 1991 and 1995 are often just considered to be really dark and bloody crime films. And they're certainly more realistic than most earlier horror films can be. But both of these, especially The Silence of the Lambs, can definitely be considered to be horror films. Wes Craven, who had initiated the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, made a film called The People Under the Stairs in 1991 that really took horror film in some important new directions in terms of making political commentaries. In addition, his film Scream from 1996, for a time at least, re-energized the slasher film by showing a turn toward a more postmodern self-consciousness. You know, that's the film, most of you probably know it, but if you don't, it's the one in which all the characters basically are fans of horror films, and they realize they're fans of slasher films in particular, and they realize that what's happening to them is like something in a slasher film, and they sort of react accordingly. Vampire films and zombie films began to explore some new territory in the 1990s. And then the decade was topped off by the Blair Witch Project from 1999, which was a huge success as a homemade or found footage horror film, inspiring lots of imitators in the following years. The exploration of a variety of different directions in horror film that was typical of 1990s horror has continued in the 21st century, except a lot of this exploration of new ground has really borne fruit lately, so that the last decade in particular has been seen by many as the greatest decade in American horror film, even greater than the 1970s. In the 21st century in general, some of the most prominent phenomena are the growth of the zombie film, which has become a very major genre, including zombie comedies that kind of riff on the genre, which is again another sign that the genre is really well established and well known. There's also been a lot of sophisticated self-conscious horror, such as Drag Me to Hell from 2009 and The Cabin in the Woods from 2012, that again, like the Scream franchise, depend on the fact that their audiences will be very familiar with horror film motifs. And also these kind of rough, homemade, found footage films have continued to be popular. Perhaps the Paranormal Activity series, which began with the original film in 2007, have been very successful. Another trend that's arisen in the early part of the 21st century that a lot of people are not too happy with is the so-called torture porn, with films like the Saw franchise beginning in 2004 that are ultra bloody and seem to depend for their effects largely on inflicting damage on the human body. But some of the films in that category have actually become more and more sophisticated, and there's some interesting things going on even in torture porn, even though it's definitely not for everybody. The other thing that's really important, I think, in the last 20 years is that horror film has become so much more international, with particular success from Japanese and French horror films. But South Korean film has done some interesting things in horror, and German film, and just about any kind of film you can think of. There's also been a turn toward more subtle, family focused horror. Again, going back to Rosemary's Baby, perhaps as the great progenitor. But films like Stoker, directed by the South Korean director Park Chan-wook, but it's a film in English. The Babadook by Jennifer Kent in 2014, an Australian film. Darren Aronofsky's Mother, It Comes at Night by Trey Edward Schultz, A Quiet Place 2018, Hereditary 2018, have been films that have really focused on the family as the source of horror. And many of these have participated in the other great trend of the last decade, which has been the rise of so-called prestige horror. Prestige horror films basically are films with maybe a little higher budgets than the typical horror film, though they don't always have very high budgets, but they tend to have very high production values. They're very well made, they're very well acted, and they have very sophisticated scripts, and they address a number of sophisticated ideas. This is also sometimes called elevated horror to sort of indicate the way in which maybe it's above, it has risen above the rest of the genre, though a lot of horror film aficionados really resent that term because it suggests that horror films in general are kind of a low sort of film. But many of these films have been very commercially successful, which has also helped to get bigger budgets for horror films going forward. Meanwhile, new studios like A24 and Blumhouse have really become major players in Hollywood because of their success in horror film. And new young directors have been extremely crucial to the growth of this kind of horror film, including people like Jordan Peele with Get Out and Us, and Ari Aster with Hereditary and Midsommar, and Robert Eggers with The Witch and The Lighthouse. Women directors have also become more important during this period, including directors such as Karen Kusama, Jennifer Kent, whom I mentioned before, Anna Lily Amirpour, whose film A Girl Walked Home Alone at Night is a tremendous vampire film. The Canadians, the Soska sisters, who do a lot of outrageous things with body horror. Sophia Takal, Anna Biller, and Coralie Farget in France have also been important horror directors in recent years. But anyway, that gives you kind of an idea. That's a very brief overview that just touches the surface, but hopefully that gives you some kind of context within which you can watch individual films going forward. Thanks.